It is wonderful to see so many people here tonight to talk about children's rights and to share their ideas. Before we begin, and consistent with DCI's strong belief in the rights of Aboriginal children, we would like to acknowledge that the place we have gathered together this evening is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. And now some welcomes. I'd particularly like to welcome DCI's patron, Gordon Cressy, and his wife, Joanne Campbell. Gordon, there you are, good. Gordon was our very first Grant Lowry lecturer, so he has a special place in our hearts. And also a special welcome to Susan Lowry, who seldom misses one of our lectures. So Susan. When we decided that our lecture this year should focus on children with intellectual disability, it took us about 2 seconds to realize that we should team up with Community Living Toronto. They have, and we can benefit from that organization's knowledge and expertise. It's been a great partnership, and I particularly would like to recognize and thank Community Living Toronto's CEO, Brad Saunders, who's there, and Angela Bradley, the Director of Resource Development and Marketing. Now it's my very great pleasure to introduce our host and moderator for this evening, Michael Enright. I'm not going to try and cover Michael's history and achievements, which are huge, and cover a span of more than 50 years. Some of them are outlined in your programs, and many of you already know the quality of Michael's work. But I do want to talk briefly about the Sunday edition, which Michael has hosted for more than 1,000 episodes. 1,000 episodes. It's an amazing program. It always manages to sound current, and yet it involves issues that are critical and really timeless. Michael's not one to avoid controversy in his personal essays. They're sometimes humorous, they're always thought-provoking, but they're never ordinary. And you know that Michael's hit a nerve when, after a particular interview, he gets responses that range all the way from, "I couldn't stand it, I had to turn my radio off," or, "You made my day, that interview was the best, thank you." So he sparks it. Now, before I turn the microphone over to Michael, I have one last thing to say, and that is to recognize his kindness and support for both of the sponsoring organizations here tonight. He's always there for us, and we love him for it. So please join me in welcoming Michael.
Thank you, Agnes. She's very grandmotherly, isn't she? But motherly, isn't it? But you don't want to get between her and her cubs. She is ferocious, especially when it comes to children in distress. I add my thanks to hers. Thank you for coming out tonight. This is an important event. In fact, I can't think of any more important issue than the rights of children, all children, including those whom we call disabled. Defense for Children International was founded in Geneva in 1979, which was the International Year of the Child. The reality at the founding of DCI was that no country protects the rights of all its children in terms of elementary qualities, things like housing, healthcare, education, nutrition. Every day, more than 38,000 children die from lack of food or shelter or primary health care. In Canada, it's an international organization, but we also are concerned about the situation in this country. In Canada, young people between the ages of 13 and 24 make up fully 20% of the country's homeless population. The Grant Lowry lecturers over the years have addressed some or all of these pressing issues. Grant himself was a tireless advocate for the rights of all children, and evidenced through his work at Central Toronto Youth Services and the YMCA. He was especially concerned about children who came from brutal backgrounds. The purpose of the Grant Lowry Lecture every spring is to sharpen, share, and advance his passion for young people through the insights of Canada's most accomplished advocates for children's rights. I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker for tonight. She has one of those resumes that you envy, and you say to yourself, God, why didn't I do that? Highly educated, speaking as someone who spent many happy years in grade 11, I envy that education. Anna McCrory works for an important international organization called Inclusion International, where she is Director of Global Advocacy and Human Rights. Ms. McCrory holds a master's degree in human rights from the University of Essex. In addition to her work on inclusion, she has been actively involved in the development of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. You might say she comes to this work of inclusion and advocacy genetically. Her mother, the writer and activist Sally Armstrong, was one of the very first journalists to focus on the plight of women in Afghanistan under the Taliban. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2018 Grant Lowry Lecturer, Ms. Anna McQuarrie.
Good evening. It is a real privilege to be here with you this evening, and it's an honor to speak at the Grant Lowry Lecture. When I look back at the esteemed speakers, I have to admit I'm humbled and more than a little intimidated. So thank you, Community Living Toronto and DCI, for inviting me here. I used to live in Toronto and work for CACL, so it's always a bit of a homecoming to be back with you. This lecture has also been a great opportunity to learn more about DCI Canada and your great work on the Convention on the Rights of Children and your efforts to achieve implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Children in Canada and see it incorporated into domestic law. I also note that at the international level, DSI is involved in a global study on children who are deprived of their liberty, and Inclusion International is also involved in that same study and have been trying to use the study to identify institutionalization as a form of deprivation of liberty. And Michael, thank you for that introduction. Your voice is so familiar to me, and listening to you transports me back to my living room, and I think it must be a Sunday, so hoping that might help calm my nerves a little bit. And while my mom isn't able to be here tonight, my brother and sister are here, which is a lovely treat for me. I'm the youngest, and I basically capped out when I was about 12 years old in their eyes, and so it's nice to actually present myself as an adult in front of my siblings, so thank you for letting that happen. And lastly, thank you to all of you for coming. I know how busy everyone is, and it's really exciting to be part of this lecture this evening. It's energizing to be in a room so full of passion and dedication to the rights of children with intellectual disabilities. We know that around the world there's an estimated 93 to 150 million kids with disabilities. While data on children with intellectual disabilities is even less precise, we ballpark that it's about 24% of kids with disabilities are children with intellectual disabilities. And it's really important that we remember when we talk about UN conventions that we are talking about the lives of these children. Around the world, children with intellectual disabilities are among the most vulnerable and the most excluded. They are often invisible and ignored by their communities, their policymakers, and their laws. By securing a human rights framework for children with disabilities, we have to acknowledge that UN conventions have already made promising change by giving us tools to shed light on the marginalization and exclusion of children with disabilities and the opportunity to tackle that exclusion. So as mentioned, I'm Anna McCrory. I'm the Director of Global Advocacy and Human Rights for Inclusion International, and I've been asked to speak tonight about UN conventions, if they are real promises or just words. And as I stand here, I feel I do have to have a bit of a confession that I'm a believer. I am an unapologetic, enthusiastic believer in conventions and their capacity to make change. The reason for this is largely related directly to my experience of being involved in the development and negotiation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, often shortened to CRPD. And I believe the CRPD offers us an opportunity to reimagine the Convention on the Rights of Children, and that the lessons learned from the development of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities gives us a unique opportunity to ensure that all conventions indeed are more than just words. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history around how we got to where we are today. So if we look back internationally, our human rights foundations took root mainly through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, followed up with the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in 1966. But over the course of time, our understanding of human rights and how they are realized has evolved. In particular, we really came to realize that particular populations experience particular rights-based violations in particular ways. So we knew we had to get more specific with our human rights treaties to be more effective. So as a result, through the 80s, we started to see more specific conventions that were being created. There's a convention on women, known as CEDAW, and certainly the Convention on the Rights of Children. Another important change over our time is that our understanding of disability has changed dramatically in the last 30 years. I dare say even in the last 10 years. So while we knew existing human rights conventions were not effectively or adequately addressing the rights of persons with disabilities, or providing rights-based solutions to exclusion. So a dedicated convention on disability became an opportunity to do this. When, in 2001, the resolution to explore the development of what's now the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities went forward, we knew we had a shot and that we could use these historical learnings of how rights are realized, of how we have come to understand disability, to create something different. When we look at the Convention on the Rights of Children and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, there's some commonalities and some differences. So the Convention on the Rights of Children took about 10 years to negotiate. It was adopted in 1989 and ratified by Canada in 1991. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities took less than 6 years from start to finish, from the 2001 resolution to the 2002 adoption. It was finished. This is like lightning speed at the United Nations. Nothing goes that fast. And in fact, it is the fastest negotiated convention in the history of the United Nations. So it was adopted in 2006 and Canada ratified in 2010. The Convention on Rights of Children was the first core human rights treaty, international human rights treaty, that had an explicit focus on the rights of kids with disabilities and was designed to provide both universal protection for children with disabilities and special recognition through Article 23, which is focused on disability, about the needs of kids with disabilities and what they need to realize those universal rights. This was a significant accomplishment, and it provided for the first time that explicit human rights protection. However, appreciating the time it was being developed, our understanding of disability at the time, it did position disability in a really medical model. Sort of falls back into that special things for special people kind of approach. It's really about specialized services, and it's anchored around this notion of best interest. And as we've come to understand more about best interest, we've really seen often best interest gets used against kids with disabilities. It's in your best interest that you're in a segregated class. It's in your best interest that you're in an institution. So this siloing that we've seen of disability in the Convention on the Rights of Children continues to have marginalizing effect on children with disability today. For example, country reports on the Convention on the Rights of the Child tend to completely ignore kids with disabilities unless they're talking about the article on disability. So the mainstream articles like education, which is a huge issue for people with disabilities, tends to be void of references to inclusive education or what education's happening for kids with disabilities. This approach undermines the opportunities for an inclusive implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Comparatively, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is firmly anchored in a social model of disability. It provides an articulation of human rights within a disability context. So the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities doesn't give us any new rights, but it says what existing rights mean for people with disabilities. It moves away from simply listing off, here's what your rights are, to articulating what has to be in place to make those rights real and meaningful. It outlines what governments, UN agencies, others need to do to make those rights real. And this approach allowed us to secure new concepts and anchor the conditions required to make inclusive rights happen. So in doing so, we were able to achieve really amazing things with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We were able to secure a right to inclusive education, not just a right to education, but a right to inclusive education. We got the right to live and be included in your community, including the right to choose where and with whom you live. This is a powerful statement in the face of closing institutions. We got the right to use support to make decisions, a significant step in dismantling guardianship regimes. We also secured for kids that children with disabilities have the right to have to respect for their evolving capacities and need to be consulted. Additionally, we secured the right of children with disabilities to retain their fertility. This was a direct hit at trying to prohibit the sterilization of children with disabilities around the world. So the convention identified the barriers that were getting in the way of realizing rights and sets the stage for reforms to ensure new rights-based approaches that have a potential to be really different. It gives us a roadmap and provides us an opportunity to reread the Convention on the Rights of Children with a new understanding of disability and what's required to ensure universal rights of children with disabilities are being realized in progressive ways. So the CRPD is not here to replace the Convention on the Rights of Children. It's not here to be the only place that we look at the rights of persons with disabilities or children with disabilities. That would simply recreate the challenge that we see with Article 23. But it does give us an opportunity to update our thinking on the rights of children with disabilities. So I mentioned that it is a convention of firsts, and it's a convention of many firsts. In addition to being the fastest negotiated convention in history, it's also the first convention that has an explicit social development dimension. This convention understands that our rights don't exist in a vacuum. Our rights are made real in our communities, and we need social development and inclusive communities for our rights to thrive. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities also has the most number of signatures received on opening day, which is really just the first day that states can sign on. It's kind of a policy wonky thing, but it showed a huge level of commitment, and it's the first time that Canada has signed a convention on opening day. So really that's kind of a lot of firsts for one convention to carry. So I want to tell you why I think it achieved all of those firsts. Because it's also the first time in history that a group affected by a convention was so deeply involved in its development and negotiations. So for me, the most significant reason I am a steadfast believer in conventions is because of how the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities came to be. I believe we need to use the lessons from that experience to help ensure that all conventions are more than just words. So for those of you who may have heard me speak before on the convention, you may recall one thing I like to highlight about myself is that I'm not a lawyer. I am you. I am civil society. Now, not being a lawyer is not a big deal, except for the fact that I was deeply involved in negotiation of an international human rights treaty. And it's also a bit of a big deal when sometimes the actual lawyers in the room get a little bit weak when I start trying to explain human rights law and in ways that make sense to me. But historically, UN treaties and international human rights law has been the domain of lawyers and legal experts. But not this time with the convention. It was the expertise of people with disabilities, of children with disabilities, and families that informed the convention. We weren't just in the room, but active participants. Inclusion International and the Canadian Association for Community Living had delegations in each negotiating session, and our delegations were led by people with disabilities and families, including a group of Canadian youth that joined us for the third ad hoc committee meeting in May of 2004. By the time we got to the final negotiating session in 2006, more than 800 people were involved in negotiating the convention and taking part in the UN in New York. This experience resulted in transformative change that for many delegates was deeply personal. Many people on states delegations had never met a person with intellectual disability before in their entire lives. So to see someone, meet someone, talk with someone about their issues, their challenges, their successes, to see their potential, to see what was going on, helped us get a genuine commitment to securing a progressive and aspirational convention. Now, I don't need to tell anybody in this room that we are not there yet. I know that. It's been almost 30 years since the Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted, and it's been 10 since the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was adopted. The statistics and outcomes for people with intellectual disabilities are not exactly uplifting here or around the world. For too many children with intellectual disabilities, exclusion and isolation remains the norm. We know that kids with disabilities are overrepresented in social welfare systems. They're more likely to live in households with lower incomes, often because someone, usually mom, has to leave the labor force to stay home to provide care. We know children with disabilities are 3 to 4 times more likely to be victims of violence. For children with intellectual disabilities, the risk of being victims of violence is 4.6 times greater. We know that around the world, children with intellectual disabilities are more likely to be out of school, establishing a lifelong pattern of exclusion. Yet, we also know that when kids are in school, they're more likely to get a job. They're more likely to have friends. They are less likely to live in poverty. They are more likely to have stronger health outcomes. Families consistently report that inclusive education is the key to breaking down barriers and building inclusive communities. So how do we get there? Well, that's where all of us kind of come in on this formula. It starts with us. We know that children with disabilities, families, and our organizations are drivers of change. We are leading innovation, and we have the solutions to the challenges that are facing us. We need to be believers because we need to drive the change, and we need to be active in our belief. It's up to us to own it, to create it, and to give it life. So what does this mean? It means we need to focus on government, but also on ourselves. Sometimes it's easier to focus on what our government isn't doing, and we all know there's a lot they are not doing. But we also need to focus on what we're doing and maybe what we're not doing. We are frustrated by the losses that we see, looking to recent supported decision-making policies in Nova Scotia, where I live, or here in Ontario. And we know we have to stand together and ensure we don't give up and that we keep fighting. Because if we give up, I guarantee the convention will never be more than anything but words. I think we have a lot to learn from the negotiations that I was talking about with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Specifically, we have learned that making something real has an impact. Real people telling real stories made the convention real for states' parties. They couldn't ignore what was in front of them. We learned that partnerships were critical, internally as well as externally. We needed to get our own house in order. The only people who benefit from a divided community is government, because it gives them permission to do nothing. So we need to align ourselves and work together in partnership. And we need to work in partnership externally. We need to work with governments. Is the convention written exactly the way I would have liked it to be? No, but it's not written exactly the way the governments would have wanted it written either. I think one of the great losses post-negotiation has been that sense of partnership. When the convention came home for domestic ratification, we were no longer in the room. We've been blocked out of the discussions and haven't been part of the hard discussions we need to have. And they can be hard discussions. And I think it's important to share, negotiating the convention was not easy. It was not an easy task to bring 192 member states together to talk about disability. It was an awful task on a lot of days. We had stereotypes, assumptions, extraordinarily offensive and outdated language use, and not just from government delegations. I have often joked that I'd anticipated the tension between government and civil society. I had not anticipated the tension amongst civil society. But over those 8 ad hoc committee negotiating sessions, we came together, we developed a common voice and a partnership with each other and with governments, and we couldn't be ignored because of that. And coming together isn't easy, but it's an essential part of moving beyond words, and I believe the way the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was developed and the results that it achieved gives us a new brand of convention that has the potential for dramatically different outcomes. So what do we need to do to make sure that conventions are more than just words? I suggest it means we need to look closely, not just at what government is doing, but what we're doing. And we have to ask ourselves some tough questions. Sort of identified 5 key areas that we need to look at. One is this notion of partnerships. We cannot do this alone, but what are we doing about this? How are we connected to mainstream advocacy organizations committed to education, for example? Inclusive education is better education for all kiddos in those classrooms. So how are we working with mainstream education partners to make sure we're all on the same page? What are we doing with groups like YMCA and Scouts Canada, who provide those critical recreational opportunities for kids to connect with their communities? Why am I still fighting to get my son into beavers, for goodness sakes? So we need to put our voice in the mix. With Time's Up and Me Too, we are witnessing an explosion of social justice. But where are we in this? How legitimate is a social justice movement that doesn't include people with intellectual disabilities? Inclusion riders were trending on Twitter. Where is our Time's Up movement? And where's our voice in that? And we know that partnerships cannot be about relinquishing space. They should be about creating shared space and a common commitment. There's a great saying, if you're not at the table, you are definitely on the menu. And you have to be there to make sure that your issues are being included. But in part, we've got to change that and to reflect one of my new favorite slogans. I don't know if anyone's seen the t-shirts that have been quite popular about this, but equal rights for others does not mean less rights for you. It's not pie. So we can't have this sense that if we're doing something for disability, we're taking something away from somebody else. We know that space for civil society is limited, and we are all fighting for airtime and space for our issues. But somewhere in that shrinking space, this sense that getting something at the sake of somebody else has taken root, and we cannot abide that narrative. There is room for us all to come together. Sometimes we do need to make space for voices that have historically been ignored. This isn't giving up rights. This is making sure all voices are at the table. At the last high-level political forum, which is the annual UN gathering for the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030 program, people were complaining, civil society groups were complaining that people with disabilities were getting too much space. And I sort of countered back saying, we're making up for lost time. Like, come on, we've got to make sure we're involved in this. So what are we doing to make sure that the voices of children with intellectual disabilities are more part of mainstream efforts and being heard across the board? 2, we need our movement alongside us. We have to be brave enough to ask ourselves the tough questions. What are we doing to bring the convention to life? What are we doing to make sure that kids with intellectual disabilities are meaningfully included in their communities? They're going to school, and we're setting them up for a future of real jobs for real pay and living ordinary lives in ordinary houses on ordinary streets. If we're expecting others to walk the walk, we need to make sure we are too, and need to make sure that we're consistent and in line with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. My third point is that no one is one-dimensional. We need to look at what matters to children with intellectual disabilities and how they see themselves. What are we doing to address that disability is only one slice of who we are? What are we doing for children with intellectual disabilities who are racialized, or live in poverty, or are homeless, the statistic that Michael quoted at the beginning, or belong to the LGBTQ communities? We can't just look at children or disability from one lens. We've got to be celebrating and addressing the diversity of who we are and children with disability in their multidimensional approaches. 4, we have to hold governments to account. I know I'm talking a lot about what we have to do and questioning ourselves on what we're doing. In no means is that taken away from the fundamental responsibility of our governments to secure our rights and provide the necessary supports and services so children with intellectual disabilities can enjoy their rights on an equal basis with others. We cannot let governments off the hook. We sometimes think that power lives really far away from us, that conventions and other laws are important things written by important people in important places and sit on a shelf in a capital city somewhere. We have to reclaim that. We have the power. It lies within us. I once met with a member of parliament who told me that if he gets 5 letters, distinct and unique, nobody wants a template, nobody wants the sort of pro forma letters, but if he gets 5 unique and distinct letters on a common issue, it raises a flag for him and he pays attention. 5. This is not insurmountable. We have to hold them accountable. We have legal processes and complaints mechanisms at our disposal in Canada. DCI has recently been involved in cases where parents of Canadian-born children are being deported. We have a strong legal system that we can and should put to use. One way of domesticating international law is to secure its recognition in domestic rulings. Canadian courts are really receptive to international standards, and it's possible for groups like DCI or CACL or Community Living Toronto to seek intervenor status in these cases. And these cases give us an opportunity to put a name and a face to exclusion. They give us a chance to go behind the headlines and show that there are real people living real lives. On the international front, Canada reports to treaty bodies on every single human rights convention. What are we doing to influence that process, to position children with intellectual disabilities in the center of those reports? And how are we then using concluding observations from those committees to keep our government's feet to the fire? And my last point, number 5, is we can't do kids without families. If we want to get real on the rights of children with intellectual disabilities, we have to get real on supporting families. Families are a fundamental support for all kids. For children with intellectual disabilities, families are often the bridge that helps them realize their rights. Families need information, opportunities to connect with each other, short breaks from their caregiving duties, and help with disability-associated costs. So, is everyone still with me? I've been blabbering on for a little bit here. I know these are not simple tasks, and they are not simple questions. I know that the answer to these questions is often, we are trying and nobody is listening or nothing is happening. For what it's worth, as a parent, I'm often overwhelmed by my own talks on these things. I sometimes sit and think, wait a minute, I've got to fight all the fights in our daily stuff and do all this stuff. It's exhausting just thinking of it. And that's where our strong advocacy organizations and memberships and partnerships have to come in. I can't do this alone. You can't do this alone. None of us can. We have to come together in solidarity and fight these fights together. Our rights are made real in our communities. The promise of convention relies both on a legal framework in our country, but also the efforts, those sometimes back-breaking, teeth-pulling, hair-pulling efforts that we put into building inclusive communities. On their own, conventions are simply legal tools. Without us, who can bring them to life and make their words real? As I said, I am a believer. I have to be. I need you to be. Because their promise starts with inclusion, and it starts with us. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Anna. Wow. So I'm Bill Sparks. I have the impossible task of thanking Anna and responding in short to Anna's words. Anna has, if you like me, you've already made notes. The entire text of Anna's talk will be available on DCI's website, Hope CLT's website also. You can download it and get your own action list. Okay. I've just circled some things here, and I'm just going to come back to them in a second. Deeply involved. Writing, committee work, negotiating is understanding. All of these negotiations leading to fast adoption. The existing rights being refined and determined and specialized down. And then the opening day signatures. I just want to comment on Anna McCrory. It is a tribute, and I've known Anna's work now for a number of years, to all of the work that she put in drafting and redrafting and making sure that words were included and gathering consensus. There is a reason why this was only a 6-year effort and adopted so quickly by the United Nations. And that is the tremendous amount of work that this person did. So Anna, that's the first thanks. The second thanks, of course, is the challenge that it's not over. If we don't want these to be words, that we want them to be real implemented documents, and that people are included, children are included, and they have ordinary lives included with the rest of us. Here's our list, and I've just circled a few of them. In fact, I've got a whole page of others, but I'm just going to concentrate on it starts with us. Okay? We need to believe, as Anna believes, that change can happen and we can do it, and that we are the drivers, and that despite all of the negotiations and the tediousness and the times when you want to go home and tear your hair out, I unfortunately did that, you don't give up. You keep going. And that if you stand together, nothing can stop you. Thank you for this. Thanks, Anna.